Um, Give us the 200 words or less on who you are and what you do, and why we're talking.
I'm a business coach and social psychologist, um, and my PhD was in the University of Nevada, Reno, where I've been teaching since that time. And I'm also the visiting professor of creativity and entrepreneurship at the Newport Business School. I have got very
Wow,
involved.
very impressive.
Thank you. I've got very involved in groups and group activity from a number of different perspectives. My motivation for that was that group that the group membership has a significant impact on your motivation to be creative.
Yeah.
You know, while we're and there's important parts of this that really come out in our discussion.
So
Um,
creativity in the sense of writing a book, making a sculpture, making a painting.
Well, the in my new book that's coming out, I make it quite clear that creativity is actually a way of thinking.
Okay.
In other words, and you can physically define it in terms of neural pathways.
Okay.
So, those people that stare at these things day in, day out could probably say, "Oh, wow, okay, I can see that neural pathway. This person is thinking creatively."
Huh.
And so, if I say what is creativity, if I'm giving a talk or something, I will quite often get the kinds of things that you said there. In other words, people defining it by its products.
Mm.
But actually, if you look at highly creative people, and I'm the son of two highly creative people. My sister's highly creative. I've been a highly creative people magnet all my life. And you quite often find that they're creative in more than one domain.
Mm.
And so, they may be a great artist, but they may also, they'll often correspond to, for instance, just thinking creatively. I mean,
Yeah.
just intuitively coming up with connections that are not in a logical, deductive kind of pattern. So
Yep.
it's really all about creativity. But
Yeah. I
the
see
trick,
that. I see that. Yeah.
you recognize that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting phenomenon. It really is. And I go on in my book to show that we all had that once when we were young. Because when you're very young, if you think about deductive logical thinking, you've actually got to have some history in order to use that. So if you're going to say, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do this, then in the back of your mind somewhere, it's got, because last time I did something like that, it didn't work.
Yeah. So you're building heuristics or getting them built into you. Yeah. That
Exactly
control your
that.
creativity.
And
Yeah.
of course, when
And
you're born,
and
you're looking at a blank sheet. So
yeah,
you
and
haven't
we've
got that.
immediately gone down an unrelated rat hole. But so is there a physical aspect to that? Because one of the things that I noticed, this is, my domain here is sort of endurance sports, is that the two are linked, right? The sort of the physical acts and the creative acts they're positively reinforcing. Did
Yes.
you find any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely the case. Yeah, for sure. Um, Yeah, now from a group perspective, the trick here is that if we're in a group, if you wander down to the Harley Davidson Club at the weekend, your relationship with that group, you want to be similar to that group.
Right,
That's your mindset when you're in that frame. And that, of course, is an incredibly important human drive,
right, right.
survival and everything else.
Right,
Now,
communal. Yeah, and
yeah,
I'll bookmark here. We're circling back to the initial topic, which
yes,
was I had sent out this missive on, I want to talk about how the country is sort of embroiled, or the world is sort of embroiled in this bipolar hate complex that
yeah.
seems to be escalating. And how do we get here and why? And you came back to me with sort of a blog post that said, here's A, B, C, D, E, right? And the A, B, C, D, E were the first one was envy, the second one was in group, out group, the third one was that groups themselves amplify an individual's polarization, right? So obviously you had some sort of uh, good response to what I had asked. It really triggered something in you. Trigger's probably the wrong word, but it made you creative somehow. Walk me through what your response was there and how you think it applies.
Um, yeah, it's let's start from the first one. I think the first one I think was envy, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's just sort of something that's pretty easy to see if, for instance, you go to a poor country and I remember visiting a little village in Mexico where the kids didn't have shoes and blah 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 blah.
sure.
And I thought, well, why are these people so darn happy? I
Right.
mean, they just were. And, I've seen that many times. I've lived and worked in 7 different countries. So
Yep.
I've got to know different cultures. And I think, and so it's quite clear to me, and there is scientific evidence for this too, that a lot of times people's contentment with their life, I'm not going to use the word happiness, but contentment is related to where they are comparatively to the people around them.
Right.
And so, if you're at the very, if you're in the middle, if you're middle class, there's a very good chance that you won't have any particular reason within that group to feel anything other than comfort. But if you're the middle class and you're the only sort of modestly wealthy person in Beverly Hills, you know, you're not going to feel that same comfort. I mean, the fact that you've only got one Rolls Royce rather than three, that kind of comparison is one of the triggers for people to be uncomfortable where they are in the context of a society. So you're beginning to
Yeah.
you've got envy developing.
Yeah, and that's very much true in the social media reinforcement, where everybody is, taking the selfie of their best life, whether, so it's a false
Yeah,
projection
yeah,
of contentment most of the time, right?
yeah.
And
Well,
then everyone's
absolutely. I mean,
comparing to that.
absolutely. I mean, your average Facebook post is somebody having a fabulous party or lying on a beach under a palm tree. It's not having an argument with your next door neighbor.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
no, absolutely. So that's the envy bit, and I think that's pretty straightforward, really. What was the next of my
In group, out group.
yes. I mean that's a pretty well established research project, and there are lots of different kind of aspects to that. But in intuitively, it's part of the human psyche to be suspicious of groups of which you're not a part.
Right.
They don't need to be directly opposing your group. I mean, that would be a very obvious kind of reason to be polarized, but they just need to be a group of which you're not aware. And so, you can kind of see the origins of that, in prehistory.
Across history. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, that in group, but the in group, out group thing can, I mean, you kind of saw this in Great Britain in the 1970s in soccer games. I mean, just, the local traders would have to put up, big wooden things over their windows to make sure they still had a shop left, after it didn't matter who won or lost. This was what was, it was going to be aggression was going to be the net result. So,
Yeah.
it,
And
it,
that's across history too. We see that with modern day sports in the US. We'll see riots after somebody wins or loses. And that
yeah,
goes all the way back to the Romans with their different colored squads in the chariot races,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Same exact
Absolutely.
behavior. So we make up reasons to be us versus them. It's something in our psychology.
It is. It is exactly that. And I think so. I think we're sort of seeing that a lot in contemporary society right now. It's one of the things that creates that polarization. What was the next thing on my list?
No, just you said, the fact that you get these groups amplifies the polarization. Like
Yeah,
it escalates that polarization.
absolutely. And so you see, um, this, you see, I mean, looking at the riots that happened in Europe in the 70s and so forth, it was very easy to see that the individuals involved in that, in general, would not have done anything like that in a pre-planned way on their own.
Right.
So, it is that process of mutual support that can take people to extremism.
Right. And we've seen that extremism in the States over the last decade. And like you said, or when we were talking before, if you pull that individual out of the group and you look at that individual as a standalone individual, it's okay, here's a dad, a small business owner, an ex-military person. These are, paragons of society, and they've gone off the deep end somehow. So how did they get there?
Well, that's really circling back to what I was saying before, where if you're in a group, if you go down, join a club, you're in a group, then it's the similarity with others which is salient. If, on the other hand, right the opposite, and it's another innate drive that we have to show our individuality. And they kind of have to have some degree of balance. If you don't get group connectedness, then you get all the problems associated with solitary confinement.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you're not allowed the opportunity to show individuality, as is the case if you're in jail or various other circumstances, then that will have its issues as well. But the point is that when you're in that group, that group leader is your leader,
Yeah.
even if they're dumber than a block of bricks compared to you. The fact that they are head honcho of that particular group, it makes them a surrogate leader for what you're doing. And the fact that you're surrounded by people who have this particular goal is why the group salience comes into play there.
Yeah.
And it is just not feasible to be the individuality, if it kicked in, would be that you leave the group.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
No, and I think in the United States this is a more acute, and probably Great Britain as well, but the United States certainly, where individualism, whatever that word is so highly regarded in the culture, right?
yeah,
Everyone is that sort of John Wayne, I've got my own gun, I take care of myself.
absolutely.
That's our culture, right? And that's driven into you from a young age. So you've got that high group dynamic,
Yes,
and then
absolutely. You have it, and that's the social scientist Hofstadter, who did a lot of research on individualism versus collectivism. He actually ranked countries regarding individualism, and the United States is at the top of that list.
right. Yeah.
And then, where places that I've lived and lived for a while in Portugal, that's the most collectivist country in Europe.
Right. Right.
And so there's a significant kind of difference there. But I think the issue.
Yeah, I can remember being in Tokyo and walking out a sidewalk and nobody moves. One person will not move alone. They
Right.
all move as a group, right?
Yes.
Whereas in the States, there's somebody trying to dash across the street, or, it's chaos, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah, Japan actually is a very weird phenomenon in terms of Hofstadter's model, but I won't go into that. But that's certainly one very important aspect of it.
Yeah. So in our current climate, we've got this dynamic, right? And this is part of how we got there. How do you unspool somebody from one of these groups, where the group itself is a destructive force on the individual, right? Where somebody's so burrowed in, that they've lost self, as it were, right?
It's a tough question. I've actually coached two people who were members of a new religious movement, and they both, well, one of them had the whole family in there within that movement. And so breaking loose from that was incredibly difficult. You see this particularly in the Melanites, some Mennonite communities in Canada, and where you literally, people are born into these, and they have extraordinarily little knowledge of what goes on in the outside world. I mean, there might be one radio in the whole place, and that's only listened to on one channel. So it is very difficult to take people out of a group, a very intensely group oriented situation, and get them into a position where they are where they really have their respect their individuality again.
Yeah.
And the way that I've done it with those two cult members was actually through creativity. I said, okay, let's have a look. One was an extremely good artist, and the other was a very good musician. And they'd done both of those things in the cult concept, in the cult context. And so when they left the cult, they couldn't even do their art and music because it took them right back to the cult place. So I had to get them to do totally different things. I mean, the artist says, well, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do your art, but let's go to an art museum before our next session. Go to an art museum and just talk about what you're seeing, looking at the pictures and so forth. And I did a similar thing with the musical guy. So I told him to find an open mic night and just really kind of get into the music that was being played. And it was kind of interesting because they both did that. And then I used that as a springboard to get them into their own creativity. And that creativity took them into having respect for their own individuality again, which had been completely lost.
Interesting.
Completely lost. So it is certainly feasible. And so, if you have a look at the kind of things that are going on now, or if you go back to sort of something like Waco, where you had, the Branch Davidians were a very tightly knit kind of group. There was the opportunity to follow some of the survivors from that. But it wasn't, to some extent, that could have been very useful in the Jim Jones context too, except that there were almost no survivors.
Right. So and the people who did survive, they made a different decision, right? And I think this goes to the crux of it, right? There's at some point on this process from normal person to rioter, right? At some point in this process, you're going to feel uneasy because it runs counter to your personal, what you believe in, right? And at some point you're going to go, I feel funny about this. This isn't right. So I think there's like these series of moments of truth as people escalate down the path from normalcy to outrage and hate, where they could address that and look at it like a fork in the road almost, right? Every one of those moments is a fork in the road. And any one of those you can turn right or turn left.
Yeah, it feels right. But there's one problem with that, and that is that if you are very disenfranchised, I mean, you literally, you live in the middle of the desert, and you just simply don't have groups around you on a regular basis, then the power of, if you want, normal society norms really isn't there to keep you on track. They are you're so distant from the practicality of those usual norms that it's very easy to go to a completely different set of norms. I mean, you see this with young gang members in a sort of post-high school kind of environment. Where once you've committed a crime, you're suddenly a hero. And then the gang, it's very easy to join the gang, and the gang and the gang's norms become your norms. And you quite often find that the child that when they were younger had, a parenting kind of environment that really didn't impress regular norms on the kid. And
Right.
so, maybe their parents were, who knows, maybe they were druggies, maybe they were, whatever it is, they just had this loose, normless kind of connection. So they didn't necessarily have, they wouldn't necessarily go through too much of a twinge saying, oh, this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And
So they lack the knowledge of self to be able to make that decision.
yeah. Yeah, and they don't, these things aren't necessarily much of, we sort of think of them as being um, innate ethical
Right.
rail,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that's not necessarily the case. If you're, if you're born without, or if you have an upbringing where you haven't got those rails, then there can be very little to kind of keep you, on the straight and narrow, because the straight
Yeah.
and narrow has never been defined.
But I think there's something different going on today with this political bipolarization or
Yeah,
polarization, bipolarization. That's funny. Um, in that if you asked the middle of the normal distribution curve person on this side and the same person on that side what their core values are, and ignoring the politics, you would find that their core values are probably identical, right?
yeah,
They're gonna say, I care about my family, I care about my town, I care about honesty, right? That's what you're gonna get, right?
yes, absolutely.
So, but they want to kill each other. So how does that happen?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question, and I don't know that there's just um, one solution, one answer to that. I mean, I think one of the things that you're seeing right now is that it's so polarized that it's virtually impossible to talk to somebody with the opposite view.
Mhm.
And I love debating this stuff. I'm a political animal,
Yeah.
but it became very obvious to me that even sort of mentioning the idea of having this discussion, years ago. I mean, before Trump term number one, um, and really everybody shrank away from that and so yes, of course, absolutely, but I can't do it right now. I'm too busy, and so they would just brush you off and not have the conversation. So, that degree of polarization um, is really is really troubling, and it doesn't necessarily imply that those same people are going to be, violent. It's a but it is it's a quite a deep philosophical polarization.
So, one of the things that I wanted to pick out was in, I'm seeing this in sort of normal people that I know, people I respect, people who are smart people, well-educated people, right? And they've gone really far right or left, right? And
Yeah.
I know that we all share these same core values. And so the question is, if you had to write me a 500 word academic post on this that says here's the solution, what would be the steps?
I think there's a real hurdle, particularly in this country, in that there are no real guardrails to stop the media from lying.
Yeah, that's true.
And if you look at Brexit, when the British Brexit debate was going on, I mean, both sides were just spouting abject
Nonsense. Yeah,
lies.
yeah,
Anybody that kind of looked below the surface, and they were, so, well, do you realize we're paying, this many millions of pounds to the EU every month? Well, they don't mention that they're getting this number plus 10% back from the EU every month. I mean,
yeah.
they're just
Yeah, it's very,
quite
very
simply
selective. Yeah.
absolutely
And
selective.
and it catastrophizes every point, right?
Yes,
So it goes from here's a randomly selected data point that, oh, by the way, means that the world's going to end.
yeah. Absolutely. And I think, in this country right now, I think part of what you're asking is explained by the fact that you have had for the past, well, probably not far off a decade, really polarized media. I mean, if you just compare Fox News to CNN or
Yeah,
MSNBC, I mean, you would get a totally different story. So
100%.
although these people may have, your friends may have sort of, the similar core goals and values, the fact that they're getting pounded with totally different information.
Yeah, both of which
Um,
are degrees of false.
yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
The false, I mean, if they were sort of being false in a way that would kind of come together, then that would be one thing, but they're not. I mean, the falsehoods themselves get so incredibly polarized.
yeah,
So they take an already polarized situation and then enhance it to maximize the polarization. And I think
yeah,
one of the things I dislike about the news media at the moment is that something that is, yeah, might be slightly wrong or slightly unethical or whatever has now become,
right,
a major deal. I mean,
right.
I don't think anybody would have agreed that, Hillary Clinton should have really been using the server, stuff, had her own
Yeah,
server and all that kind of thing. But should that really have cost her the election? Because it probably did.
yeah,
You
who
know,
knows, right? Again, we I don't want to name names or go places because then
no,
people shut off, right?
but either way, I mean, either way, that that kind of thing is was I
Right.
saw that
It's
as the beginning of real extremism in terms of
right.
taking a relatively
Yeah.
small item and blowing it out of proportion.
Yeah, and that's I guess what I would recommend is people just to I know that we've been saying this all along, is just to have sort of a jaundiced eye for this stuff when it comes across. Because it's being served up to you on purpose to make you afraid.
Yeah.
And I think what's the Voltaire quote that says if I can wait, I wrote it down. If they can get you to believe in absurdity, they can get you to commit atrocity.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll move you to the exit. Do you have any links or any how people can find you or any ask?
Um, I can send you my
But you've written books and that sort of thing that you want people to know about?
yeah, I'm just coming out with another book. And I'm giving a TED talk in August, but we can't show
Ooh,
that yet.
yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, that'll be great fun. But as I say, I can't talk. I'm not allowed to talk about that yet. But
So
that's
what's your main link for people to find your content?
I guess either I've got two websites, and I guess my LinkedIn profile really is probably the way to go with that.
And
I can, pull that up right now and put it in the chat if that would be
no, that's
useful.
fine. You can send it to me afterward. I would just people are listening to this right now, so we could say go find Dr. Andre Walton on LinkedIn, and you'll have a source to his links, I guess is what I would say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So final thought here is so I've been looking at this and we're in this it feels like we're in a cultural inflection point and I it's been scaring me because of course I'm catastrophizing that, but it could also be a rebirth. We could be breaking the shell and emerging into something better, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think historically too, if you see these kinds of times going on, I mean, I can remember in the Margaret Thatcher era of the UK when you had incredible um, disruption in the attitude to trade unions, for instance. And, particularly, I mean, in the days of when Maggie Thatcher was trying to shut down the coal mines and all that.
Yeah.
And a group of coal miners actually took a very large concrete pole, threw it off and over one of these bridges over the freeway, and it smashed into the car that was taking a black leg to work and killed him, demolished the car, and killed the taxi driver. And I think at that point, the British, the reaction was huge, and I think people suddenly woke up and
Yeah.
said, this is totally out of court. We can't do this.
Yeah.
And I think so. At that point,
So unfortunately something like a Kent State has to happen in order to
yeah,
turn the culture, right? We have to go a step too far, which amazes me because some of the events of the last 10 years I would have considered a step too far. But yeah.
yes,
All right, I'm gonna have to let you go. We're running out of time. But
sounds good.
this is fascinating. I'm gonna go look at your profile and see what I can get for your books. All right.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you, Chris.
Thank you. Bye-bye.